Good afternoon, everybody. Panaunda. You've seen everybody filtering in. My name's Nicole Thomas, and you have arrived in my webinar sharing my thesis. So I'm just going to give a couple of seconds for a few more people to join. So yeah, like I said, Panaunda, good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining this afternoon. My name's Nicole Thomas. I'm an educational psychologist in Wrexham in North Wales. I'm really pleased to be here sharing my thesis research with you. Does that mean we're middle class now? Experiences of educational psychologists who identify as coming from a low socioeconomic status background in accessing, training and practicing within the profession. So I'm going to be giving a brief overview of previous research, rationale, methods, but I'm going to spend most of my time this afternoon, most of my 30 minutes time, talking about the findings and implications. And I will share the link to my thesis at the end if anyone's interested in reading the whole thing. I'm happy for any questions or comments. Sarah's asked me to ask you to use the Q&A box if you want any specific kind of Q&As. At the end, I'll have a few minutes to look at those. So before I start on about my research, it's really important for me to just flag this issue of defining and measuring low socioeconomic status. So again, I go into this in more detail in my thesis, but really briefly, socioeconomic status is commonly measured in terms of a person's education, income, and occupation. So it's one aspect of social class that can be more clearly defined. But despite this, there are it's difficult within the research. An ultimate definition of socioeconomic status is debated, but it's suggested that people think more readily in terms of a person's socioeconomic status. Social class is a more complex kind of concept. So I chose to use the term socioeconomic status as a definition. And like I said, there are objective measures to determine socioeconomic status, which focus on things like parental occupation, access to free school meals whilst at school, participation in higher education. But there are limitations to each of those measures. So that is another reason why in my study, as I will come on to say, people were asked to as if they kind of identify themselves with coming from a low socioeconomic status. So just wanted to flag that up right at the beginning. The research, when you look at sort of outcomes and things for those from low socioeconomic status, is quite bleak and paints a somewhat hopeless picture. It states that the outcomes, if you're from a low socioeconomic status in health, education, and life in general, tend to be more likely to be negative. There's research looking at experience of adverse childhood experiences, and those from low socioeconomic status are more likely to experience those. But also what the research says is a significant driver of upward social mobility, should I say, is accessing higher education. So there's been loads of government kind of initiatives over the years and research around widening participation. So getting more young people from low participation, low socioeconomic status type areas into higher education to try to support that upward social mobility. But lots of the research looks at numbers and statistics. So there's not that much around, it's just how much percentage increase have we seen in such areas. And then research into graduate outcomes has been dominated, like I said, by quantifiable measures and often overlooks the issues. We got these people into higher education, but what are their experiences whilst they're there, and what, there's a lack of qualitative exploration. And there's a real lack of this, particularly with doctoral students as well. So in doing this sort of scoping literature review, I had identified a gap, which is that of where I arrived. There was no research on EPs specifically, or even within the wider psychology professions, and in terms of the impact of low socioeconomic status background. So why is this relevant to us other than specifically to the person? So EPs work with children and young people who have learning needs, and those who access free school meals are more likely to have additional learning needs. So those who access free school meals are more likely to also be from a low socioeconomic status. Therefore, it's good to say that EPs are likely to work with a lot of families from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. Obviously, recent workforce surveys about what the kind of demographic of the EP profession is suggest there is a lack of diversity within our profession. And although there are limitations, obviously, to surveys and things, it raises an important issue there. And obviously, equality and diversity is really topical within the wider psychological community, but there is a lack of, well, there was no qualitative research in my specific area at the time. So it's obviously directly relevant to the families, children, young people we work with, and as well when thinking about the demographic of the profession. So my methods, there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm just going to give a bit of an overview. So I went with a critical realist, ontological and epistemological stance. So there is a reality, but we interpret this through our experiences differently. And that is part of the reason why my participants were allowed to self-identify as coming from a low socioeconomic status background. It was qualitative, because that lovely quote from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation illustrates, this is a story that can't really be told just through graphs and charts and numbers. So I did 10 semi-structured interviews with qualified EPs. I believe there were 4 newly qualified, 4 main grade EPs. I had a senior specialist, a specialist EP and a principal EP. All of my participants were between 24 and 44 years old. I had 8 females, 2 males, and 8 worked for a local authority. 1 was independent, and I had 1 university tutor, I think memory serves me. So a little bit of a mix, but there was, I think 2 were from Wales and 8 were from England, and there were none from anywhere else, any other regions. So they were recruited via a gatekeeper letter that I believe I sent through NAPEP a long time ago, and this poster on social media, which details the inclusion criteria. So I wanted EPs who had trained and worked in the UK, completed the doctorate because that mirrors the current route to train as an EP, and identify themselves as coming from a low socioeconomic status background, because, as I said, that does align with my ontological and epistemological stance, but also there have been lots of criticisms of those objective measures, so there's not a universally accepted measure. So, and I use reflexive thematic analysis to analyse my data. So my research questions, I had research question 1, which was, what are the experiences of EPs who identify as coming from a low socioeconomic status background in training to be an EP? What are the facilitators and barriers for accessing and completing the doctorate? So research question 1 looks at experiences with the doctorate, so getting on and completing. And then research, what are the experiences of EPs who identify as coming from an LSS background in practicing in the profession? So how has coming from a low socioeconomic status background impacted or influenced this? So research question 1 around training, accessing and completing. Research question 2 was around, once qualified, how had their backgrounds impacted or influenced their work in practice? So my results are displayed here just as a summary. I'm going to talk through each of the themes now. I displayed it via thematic map. So I'm going to go through them now, theme by theme, in relation to the research question that they address. So experiences of accessing and completing the doctorate. In relation to research question 1, theme 1 really largely looks at the barriers. So theme 1 is, you'll notice a few of my themes and sub-themes are named with quotations because they are direct quotes from my participants. So theme 1, it isn't going to land in your lap, that's for sure. And the sub-themes under that, what is an EP? So having an awareness of the role and the profession as a whole, and how to train. Doing a doctorate was just not within reach for someone like me. So there's kind of psychological barriers around completing a doctorate because of their background. And then the financial implications of accessing and completing the doctorate. You get such a poverty wage from the doctorate. So I'm going to do now is I'm going to present some direct quotations from my participants that help you to sort of, it gives real colour to the data. So just on this theme, I've used pseudonyms for all my participants. So this top one here, Liam says, one of the things is knowing about educational psychology, like knowing that exists. That was critical. I didn't know it existed. Then Esme here, it wasn't until my final year I had a look at she's talking about her undergraduate. I had a look at the route to train to be an EP. I was like, oh, I have to complete a 3-year doctorate. Okay, then I thought, oh, okay, that's fine. I'll just apply, not realizing actually how competitive it was and how limited the places were. So even prior to applying, not having an awareness of the role at all, but then also not having an awareness of the route to be able to train. Imogen talks here about on the interview day feeling alienated. She says, I felt really alienated at the interview day. I really didn't feel like, Imogen from rural area with a little bit of a chavvy accent would fit in very well with what was going on there. So that kind of not feeling as though they belong within that, that environment, that situation there. Liam again talks about his interview experience and asking personal questions. He says, one of the interviews, they asked a lot of personal questions about my background, my early life experiences. I remember I got into a situation where I was crying in an interview because I was just not expecting to touch on some of the subjects with this panel of strangers. So some considerations there about, the questions they're asking and what sort of memories and feelings that may stir up for some people. And then regarding the financial implications, Stephanie shares here, I felt like I was just starting to get used to having money. Then when I got on the doctoral course, the drop in salary was massive. And Rosie's statement here, I remember being in tears saying to my mum, like, I can't do this. I haven't got the money to do this. I'm going to have to just say I can't do the course. So even before they've got onto the doctorate at all, there's all these considerations, these barriers that they felt as though they'd experienced. Moving to theme 2, staying on research question 1 with the barriers to accessing and completing the course. Theme 2 is called At Times It Felt Really Unfair and refers to the set of sort of injustices almost that my participants experienced in terms of being able to access the doctorate. So there's sub-theme 1, which is lack of exposure to the EP world. Sub-theme 2, I had to move there, which was the first issue in relation to the difficulties in accessing university and placement. And the third sub-theme is I felt that I had to juggle. So lots of participants talked about the demands in terms of academically, but also cost of living and having to hold down jobs and manage that. And they felt all these things that they had or had not experienced or obtained, and other TEPs that they were training with at the time didn't have these things to think about. So some quotations from this theme. Rosie talks here. I remember feeling so othered, like ridiculously othered from it. It kind of was quite obvious, my lack of experience. I felt inferior because I was one of 2 people that didn't have an assistant EP job, which meant that I started the course having no idea really what an EP does. I could apply psychology, but I didn't know educational psychology. I didn't even know anybody who did a job that required a degree. A lot of the TEPs had parents that were EPs, or they knew people who were EPs, or they had a Senko friend, and that's how they got in. And that astounded me. So Rosie there reflecting on, the lack of professional connection, the lack of exposure to this world, if you like, despite the fact that she was good enough to get a place on the course and still feeling like that, once sort of comparing ourselves to her peers on the course. Stephanie talks about the juggling thing here. It felt very unrelenting, like that pace was continual. I was either in lectures or seminars or working one job or getting up and working the other job. I'd work the Saturday night at the nightclub, then I'd have to be up on Sunday for work. even when I came home, I had then picked up seasonal work. So, she had to do that in order to afford kind of to be able to live whilst she was training. And she felt as though that was not something that everybody on her course had to think about. Quite a few of them talked about this lack of a financial safety net, and that adding kind of a worry always in the back of their mind, which they felt not everyone had to deal with. Lorraine talks about the belief that because she had no professional networks and connections, she really had to strive to build those. She said, I felt really bitter and injustice. I felt like I spent 3 years scrabbling around, building up my experience, targeting it at getting on, trying to talk to people and build up my networks and links. And she's referring to a colleague. You did psychology at a posh university next door and have been told, yeah, this is what you should do. So you can really feel the kind of emotive feeling behind that of, it's not this lack of equity in experience here. Yeah, and Kerry talks about the difficulty with location and having to get to university. So she says, I was schlepping 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the evening on a combination of driving and trains. I often would get my bursary through, then I would look ahead to the timetable for the next month and buy all my trains on a split ticketing app to make them as cheap as possible. Which again, she shared, not everybody had to do that. And it was very intense in terms of the commute, which wasn't accessible physically or financially, really. And this one was Stephanie, is one that's actually stuck with me quite a bit. And I have, there's quite a few quite poignant quotes, but this one in particular. I had times where I had to not go into placement and say I was unwell, but actually I couldn't afford the petrol. And so I said I wasn't well, but I actually couldn't afford the trip. I think that will have influenced how reliable I was seen as on the course and perhaps how dedicated I was to training as an EP, when actually it was something I was really wanting and busting a gut to do. So, that those implications, the financial the lack of financial resources, because the lack of financial safety net from the family, and the implication there of not looking as though she's, as dedicated as other people. So we're carrying on the theme of barriers, and theme 5, it's really difficult to talk about. So theme 5 encapsulates the sub-themes of low socioeconomic status is invisible. It's quite taboo and people found it difficult to sort of raise as a subject. And no one's asking these questions. So the belief that there wasn't really the space held in university or in their placements for these conversations to be had, really. Yeah, so I like this quote from Josiah. It's hidden, isn't it? Unlike being a wheelchair user or being Black, that experience of poverty is hidden. You don't know unless someone says. There's nothing about me that would say this guy grew up without having any electricity over the weekends, or, having to sit by candlelight because the electricity has gone out, unless you disclose it, which I think puts it, I suppose, very similar to gender identity and sexuality. It's often hidden. And obviously, I'm sure some of you who are listening are interested in this topic and aware that there is a debate around adding, socioeconomic status as a protected characteristic, along with some of those others that Josiah mentioned there. Yeah, and Debbie's reflected, I think it's really great that you're even exploring this and investigating, because no one's been asking these questions. So I think that's the other thing that drew me to this study, is no one has been asking these questions. So again, there's been no space to have these conversations. Rosie talked about not really feeling understood, and the assumptions that were made around her. So she says, I always thought nobody kind of got it where I was in my situation with my level of income. Nobody realised because I went to a good university, because I've got this accent, everybody just assumed I was quite well off. So she felt as though there was no room for her to share her experiences because the assumptions had been made by others, that she had this background already. Okay, so we'll move on to a bit more positive. So the experiences whilst training on the doctorate, or whilst to access the doctorate, what the facilitators were to this. So theme 3 is titled Finding a Way Out, and refers to the kind of intrinsic kind of motivation that my participants had. Sub-theme 1, I decided I can't keep doing this forever. I want to do something that's actually a career. So that motivation to kind of better their situation. And then support throughout the EP journey, which could be from family and friends, colleagues, other professionals, or financial support from, like the bursary and things as well. So these were all really helpful for people to be able to access and complete the doctorate. Some more quotes. Debbie says, I think it was just purely down to persistence. I think because of my experiences, I've always had the drive to kind of achieve my goals because I have no one else to rely on but myself. I think I've always had that view from an early age. So that kind of the values that were instilled in her because of her background, she believes, have been really helpful in her experience to becoming an EP. Josiah shows some kind of appreciation for the funding setup of the course. I was very grateful. If the course wasn't funded, there's absolutely no way on earth I could have done it. So I didn't just get a £15,000 bursary. I got like my £35,000 tuition fee paid. So some positives there that financial support enabled him to be able to train as an EP. I also incredibly value my colleagues' support and being able to message them and go, what do you think about this? I've had this experience, kind of talking it through with someone. So the support that Natalie felt from her colleagues really helped her throughout her time on the doctorate. That peer kind of support was really important as well. I love this quote from Rosie. I think those open days are really great because what they do is say, look at us, we're not aliens from a different planet. You can access this world too. She was referring to like EP service open days as opposed to university open days. I think she went and met her local service before she trained, and that made a real difference. Okay, so general experiences in terms of completing training and practicing over time. Theme 4 looks at this sort of journey, evolution of self that my participants reported throughout their EP journey. So there was this journey to achieve belonging, so prior to, during, after training, personal development over that time period, and then the quotation that I believe was from my participant pseudonym Kerry. Does that mean we're middle class now? Which obviously ultimately became part of my title. And I think that just really encapsulates that kind of internal difficulty with the assumed change of socioeconomic status upon qualifying as an EP. And the discomfort with that, quite a few people talked about. Obviously, I haven't got the time to go through and share all of the quotations from my participants, but quite a few people talked about having a sense of deference from their families and friends about being a doctor, and having this sudden sort of status change. And people talked about when we'd go out for food, my friends would expect me to pay now because I was a doctor and all this type of thing. They felt really uncomfortable with that newfound status following qualifying, if you like. Esme talks about difficulty fitting in whilst training. So she says, I felt like I didn't really belong and I didn't really fit in. Sometimes I didn't fit in terms of the attitudes of other people. I think because of growing up in an area of high deprivation, I have a slightly different perspective on things. So her way of thinking didn't really align with, she was talking here about training on the doctorate. That she struggled a bit when she was a TEP because other people didn't quite think the same way as her owing to her background. When I was a trainee with those two worlds colliding made me feel very uncomfortable and made me put on quite a show and perhaps pretend to be someone I wasn't. So Imogen was referring here to when she was training to be an EP and going into, placement and university and then returning home and speaking to friends who obviously weren't in the world and finding it really difficult. And she said that she felt, she had to like the certain things that were stereotypical and she had to be a certain way and act a certain way and talk a certain way when she was a trainee. But she goes on to say, now I'm just like, well, I don't really care if people judge me for not wanting to go and eat at a certain place and take a certain holiday. I'm a good EP, I believe. It's got nothing to do with my background. I don't have that anxiety anymore that I've got to be that cookie cutter middle class EP, which I had thought I would have to when I was a TEP. So this idea that, there was a cookie cutter sort of this is what an EP is, and this is what I have to take a journey and be. This kind of sort of comfort with this is who I am, and acceptance of the self, the journey throughout training and qualifying. So in terms of practicing, so once being qualified, the research question 2, how does the LSAS background impact or influence how they work? So this was all around theme 6. Coming from a low socioeconomic status background can give you all kinds of advantages. So again, quite nice and positive. So people talked about their experiences equipping them with a greater understanding of the real world and how the real world kind of runs. The real ability to build a rapport with families. I really click with families, and motivation to affect change in the profession because of their backgrounds and experiences. A lot of people talked about this, having walked in that situation and having an understanding and how it changes their practice. So Kerry says, when I'm talking to parents, I think to myself, if I said that in front of my mum, would she know what I mean? So that there, Kerry's reflecting on her practice all the time to try to remain accessible and, not put up any kind of barriers to parents based on her experiences from her mother. And Josiah's quote here is lovely. I have a real strong drive towards transparency, democracy, openness, collegiality, collaboration. And I think that comes from a sense of unfairness when you're poor. Lots is very unfair, and you don't really get to know why things have happened or how they've happened. It just happens to you. And I think that really aligns nicely with, the person-centered approach and practice that we strive to have in Wales as EPs, and doing with as opposed to doing to, and that's something that's instilled these values in Josiah in the way that he practices. Esme talked here about offering to go back to her old school. I believe this participant went back to working in a local authority where she grew up, and she said that she always offers to speak at her old school about educational psychology and the route into it, just to be a relatable role model. So she says, somebody from a similar background and a similar area of educational experience talking to you about how they got into psychology, so that real drive to make it accessible, seem accessible and not completely out of reach, which links back to the first theme where that people said, doing a doctorate is not for someone like me. People who've come through that are really motivated to say, yes, you can, because I have. And this quote from Imogen, a large proportion of families we work with come from lower socioeconomic status background. So who better to support them than somebody who has come from a lower socioeconomic background and can really understand that adversity? I'm not saying those who haven't are not able to apply the psychology and support them and be empathetic, but I think that variety is going to be really helpful in the profession. So really having that lived experience of being that person really is helpful in her everyday practice. Excuse me. So we're on to the so what now. What does all that tell us? Okay, so implications for training institutions, so universities. Raising awareness and hosting events is really, really important. So there's lots of places do this really well, but it's making sure that there needs to be more kind of accessible information, outreach at earlier stages, and to sort of rural areas and things like that is important. Information should be readily available and shared about the entry requirements for the doctorate. And it's about thinking how that information is presented. Is it accessible to people who are not in the EP world? Would they know where to find it? Does it make sense to these people? So that's really important as well. I think as well, a few of the participants talked about their experiences at interview and how they felt they were being interviewed by tutors, and it was quite a daunting experience. And so thinking about, I know some universities already do this. I know Cardiff University do, because it was my experience. Interviews with tutors, but also maybe stakeholders and maybe, other people who, you'd have to interact with, so that people have got that chance to show their ability to build rapport with, people who you would be encountering in everyday work. So yeah, just another look at the interview panel, and accessibility of interview days as well is another thing. In terms of with trainee EPs and in tutor teams, use of culturally competent supervision models. I talk about this again more in my write-up, and there's a few examples of how this can be used. Considering mentoring for new TEPs, particularly those who might not have come as an assistant EP or might have come from this type of background, to enable them to feel supported, and asking those questions and collecting that data, if you like, of, the Social Mobility Commission actually suggested that universities really need to be looking at what measurements they're gathering, what data they're gathering, to track maybe the number of applicants from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and what proportion are accepted onto the course, make sure the attrition rates or the interruption of study are traced, things like that. And obviously, like I've stated, measuring low socioeconomic status is difficult, but maybe there could be some room to allow for self-identification. There's a lot. I could talk about this for a long time, so I'm very much trying to keep to time. Yeah, and then obviously for those who might have to travel or commute long distances to their university, using hybrid, online and in-person teaching where appropriate and applicable. I know lots of universities already do this. Yeah, and I suppose in line with that, the mentoring and the culturally competent supervision, it's having those conversations, and I know some courses do this and do provide the space for that, but just giving that room really for people to share their experiences is really, really important. And also, there it is. Also, it's really important. Quite a few of my participants, obviously, they trained. Well, they've all trained on the doctorate, so since 2006, but at different times. Quite a few people talked about having a really difficult time financially for various reasons and not being eligible for the hardship funds that their universities have because of the bursary. So there's a real need there for a review of eligibility for them to be able to access that financial support as TEPs. And also something that's a little bit of a bigger thing, the geographical locations of training institutions, because it is not spread equally at all, and it's not accessible for a lot of people who do have to uproot their lives. And if they're from a low socioeconomic status and they have to do that, then the lack of resources they might have. Again, I can talk about this for a long time, so I welcome more conversations about it outside of this, but I am running out of time. In terms of ed psych services and EPs yourselves, what kind of things would be good? Open days and events, they're always great, and offering them in an accessible way, obviously free and online, and multiple sort of different times and things. Also, just being out there in your schools, like having those conversations in practice. If you have teachers, TAs, students, whoever that's interested in also how did you become an ed psych, and having those conversations and making it accessible, so that it's demystifying it a bit, because quite a few of my participants talked about it's like having a secret language that I didn't know and that I had to get to know. So just being a bit more open to those conversations as well. Again, reviewing accessibility and availability of information. Really, I just said that, making links with your schools and colleges and talking at open events. Again, like one of my participants said, in your local area, speaking to people and being able to relate and say, I was in your position, I went to the school, or I grew up in this area, is really, really powerful. To demonstrate, because I think there's some research that suggests it's not that there's no aspirations with people from low socioeconomic status, it's that the gap between the aspiration and then, the ability for them to be able to get where they want to be, it's difficult. Anyway, I could go on about that for a long, long time. And yeah, culturally competent peer and professional supervisions would be really good to implement as well. I always just stick this slide in. There's loads and loads of things that can be done, further research. I'd really encourage, I don't know if there's any TEPs listening, but if they've got interest in this area, do what I did, but learn from my limitations. There's loads of detail on my thesis about stuff I wish I'd have done. There's loads of things. I really expected intersectionality to come up more, and it just didn't come out as a theme from my participants. Exploring those who trained in Northern Ireland, Scotland, male EPs, obviously ethnic minorities as well. I had the majority of my participants were white as well. So I acknowledge, again, I go into it more in my write-up, that there's definitely room for more exploration. And current TEPs from low socioeconomic status backgrounds would be another great area. The reason I didn't, again, justified in my thesis, is they are quite a discrete kind of group, and qualified EPs had the ability to reflect back and from a place of being qualified and having that sort of change in socioeconomic status, and to reflect over it, their whole experience. But exploring this with current TEPs would be really, really great. So thank you for listening. I put my link to my thesis there and my Twitter or X account, if you want to follow me and have conversations about this. Just to say, I'm not sort of an expert in this area, but I do love talking about it, and I'm very keen to have more conversations. I was talking to Sarah before and saying I'm striving to publish, so watch the space. But yeah, you can find my thesis through looking on Cardiff's Orca digital repository. There's still so much more I could say, but we've come to time. So I will just check if I've got Q&As and things. Yeah, somebody has asked, they wonder if there's any data about how many EPs were assessed by an EP as a child. That's actually one of my participants said that the reason they knew what an EP was because they had an EP assessment as a child, and they were really encouraged by the way that they'd had an experience with that professional, and that's how they knew what an EP was, and they thought, I want to do that job. But that'd be really interesting to find out. And that type of thinking, it makes my brain just goes pinging off in all different directions, and I talk about this as well. So yeah, I think this is something that, as Sarah was saying when we were talking before, it's needs more research in this area. And I really thank you very much for your kind of your attendance really today. And if there's any questions, I'm just trying to skim through. Oh yeah, Sarah's put the link to my Twitter on there. But yeah, thank you very, very much for attending this afternoon. And yeah, get in contact if you'd like to. I'm going to stop it there now for Sarah to end the webinar. And I look forward to speaking to anybody who wants to reach out. And please replicate it and go forth if you're interested. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody.